Hello and welcome to the Two Gals and a Mic podcast. I'm your host, Sue Kerber, and today I'm sitting down with Dr. Rebecka Pearson, who's a depth psychotherapist specializing in trauma therapy and using her ability to read and feel others' emotions to help guide them to healing. Rebecka, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Sue. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I'm always curious as to why one would choose to work in the clinical mental health field. Tell us a little bit about your journey and the reason that you chose this path.
I think, a lot of times people are drawn to work in mental health or in the helping professions in general because of their own personal experience. And I would say that's true for me as well. I grew up southeast Pennsylvania in kind of a rural area of the state and grew up on a farm. And while from the outside looking in, my family was probably pretty beautiful and looked like it had it all together. And the reality of what was kind of going on behind closed doors wasn't necessarily so beautiful all the time. And I grew up with some exposure to alcoholism and domestic violence and physical and emotional abuse in the family system. And when my parents got divorced or when they separated, I was 12 and it was pretty messy. And so my early experiences in therapy were not terribly helpful. I didn't find that I got a ton of support, and it felt like the therapists were taking my parents' side a lot. I didn't feel terribly validated. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I even considered mental health as a field. And at that point, I sort of realized that I thought I could do it better. That I thought, based on my experience with animals and with nature and with learning how to mirror and empathize with people, I could definitely do a better job. But also I think the wounds that I had from my early childhood experiences and my teen years that were so tough really set me up to be called to the work. I like to talk about therapy as a vocation, and the root of the word vocation is to call. This idea of the work of mental health or counseling is very much a vocation. It's something that people get called to do, and it's not something that you generally pick out as sort of the college handbook list of something that sounds kind of fun. It's more something that you get drawn to. So that's how I ended up in the field.
You mentioned empathizing with people, and you're an incredibly empathetic and intuitive person, especially when it comes to other people's experiences. When did you first notice this about yourself, and how have you used this gift?
I don't think I actually really consciously noticed that it was a gift until quite a ways down the line, maybe even into my 30s, honestly. I knew that I had something. I knew that it was something, but I wouldn't have called it empathy until much, much later in my life. My dad's a horseshoer by trade, and he ended up actually being inducted into the International Horseshoer Hall of Fame, if you can believe that there is such a thing. He shod horses for the American Olympic team a couple of times, the Canadian Olympic team, was in Barcelona, was in Atlanta, a couple different places, the World Championships, et sort of, et cetera. So he had this big career, and my benefit to that was that I got to grow up with horses. He would bring home the horses that were biting and kids and kicking and throwing kids off in the arena, and would bring them home and turn me loose with them. And I learned my early education of empathy really was from animals, and horses in particular, because horses are prey animals. They're like deer in a way. That's sort of an easy way for people to think about them. They're pretty spooky and they're pretty flighty by nature. And that's because of the nature of the predator-prey relationship. And so they're exceptionally good at reading the communication, the environment around them, and humans, because to horses, we're predators. So having been exposed from such an early age to horses that had some of their own issues and were maybe a little bit tougher to deal with than some of the more baroque animals that you might see in a normal kind of riding program, I had the opportunity to learn how to work with them, how to manage my own nonverbal skills, my body language, my eye contact. There's so much sort of nuance that goes into really working closely with a 1,500-pound animal that's maybe had some trauma themselves, that taught me the skills that I had. So I knew I was good with working with animals and working with horses, and I would have said that I was a great horseman and that I consider my first career. But it didn't translate into the human realm for me. I wasn't a terribly social person. I'm still very introverted. I love my alone time. I like my space. I relate better with animals, generally speaking. So I think it probably wasn't until I was well into my counseling career that I would have said I'm good with people in terms of empathy.
I know you also have a heart for working with veterans and first responders, and there's a lot of equine therapy that goes into veteran and first responder programs. For you, why the connection with these groups?
Both of my grandfathers served, and I didn't have a real close connection, and we didn't talk about their service growing up, so I didn't know anything about it. I didn't really get exposed to the veteran community until I moved to Montana and got offered basically a contract position doing some mental health work for a local nonprofit called Eagle Mount. They do recreation therapy for folks with disabilities, generally speaking, and they have a very specific program that's for Montana veterans with disabilities. And I got connected with them and started doing these camps. That was my very first exposure to veterans in a real meaningful way. I got to spend 3 to 7 days with groups of 6 to 12 veterans and sometimes their spouses or partners or friends, a guest that they would bring along. And in that time, I started to hear stories. And these were profound stories of, mostly, unfortunately, heartbreaking experiences. I found myself really moved into tears many times about how much these folks had sacrificed, how much they had lost, how much they didn't know what they were getting into prior to even enlisting. Then, of course, the frustrating and enraging in some ways part of hearing the stories about the lack of care and the lack of service and the lack of support for when they returned back to civilian life, and how kind of lost almost every single one of them has felt. Two of the folks, unfortunately, that I got the opportunity to spend time with through those camps did die by suicide. These folks didn't have what they needed. And that was really frustrating for me to feel like I had a skill set and that these folks weren't being taken care of and that they'd been really through a whole lot of unbelievable circumstances. At the time when I started doing that work with Eagle Mount, I had not yet decided on my specific topic for my dissertation. I was in a PhD program, and it just lit a spark in me. It was like I knew that I wanted to study more about how to help this particular group of people that had given their lives, so many of them, and whether they were still alive or not, they'd still given their lives. And we don't, I think, always as civilians really understand or comprehend that to the degree that I think it needs to be understood. I wanted to do something. It drove me to act. And so then I focused my dissertation on veterans with post-traumatic stress and how to incorporate alternative methods or modes of healing, in particular equine-assisted therapy. I looked at, some statistics, and I looked at how we can maybe bring in horses, what the metaphor of working with horses might pull in for veterans. There's actually some really cool parallel process stuff with vets and horses, because back, hundreds of years ago, horses were a big part of military life. And so the connection between, man, if you will, or woman and horse in battle is, straight through mythology, through our history, and it's still actually a thing in some places, in some ways, that gets used. And what ultimately came out of that research was this idea that the horses were my very first teachers of how to be a psychotherapist, of how to be a clinician, of how to be my best helper. They taught me the nonverbal communication, the ability to be with someone who is incredibly traumatized without re-traumatizing them, without harming them further, without pushing them in places in ways that they don't need to go. And it actually ended up with this idea that I would start somehow, which I haven't yet done, but it's still in the works, a training program that would get incorporated into counseling programs that uses horses to help clinicians learn how to work with folks that are struggling with trauma. Because everybody has trauma. It's just that the veteran and first responder piece specifically is quite unique in terms of how that gets integrated into body, psyche, and soul. The first responder piece is a little bit different. So my brother-in-law is actually captain of Big Sky Fire Department and has been serving as a firefighter for, I think, 12 years now. And so I've had a lot of exposure to the first responder world through him. So I've had extensive extra training in lots of different modes of trauma treatment for veterans first responders, but across the board as well. And those two populations are just near and dear to my heart. I think these are people that, and you yourself, Sue, right, that they make the decision, they make a conscious, intentional choice to try to help and save and fight for things that feel right for them and put themselves in danger to protect other people. And I think there's something really noble about that. And my little way, having not served myself, of giving back is to try to help heal whatever wounds they might come away with.
What you're doing and these ideas that you just talked about connect a lot with the idea of playing big. And you offered a quote that you live by Marianne Williamson, which says, "Your playing small does not serve the world." Why does this quote resonate with you? And what advice can you give us to help us all play big?
Gosh, that quote has just sort of almost haunted me. I heard it when I was a teenager and was kind of in a rough time going through my parents', separation and long battle, custody battle, financial battle that was quite ugly. And I heard it somewhere along the way. It was like getting punched in the gut, right? Like you hear something and it just hits you. And I couldn't at that time. It definitely, I wasn't in a place where I could really lean into playing big. I didn't really know what that meant. I was honestly just in survival mode myself at that point. I think the power behind that quote is that we don't do anyone a service when we're not living up to our fullest potential, whatever that is. That might be taking care of your family by staying at home and raising your children. That might be exactly the biggest, best place, the best use, your highest potential, your highest good. But it could also be something bigger in a different way. It could be signing up to serve your country. It could be signing up to try to protect civilians in different ways through first responding. It could be trying to educate other people. It can look all sorts of different ways. But I think ultimately there's always the metaphor that gets used, right? We put our own oxygen mask on first on the airplane before we help the person next to us. And that's a little bit the translation for me. It's like, if I can become my best self, my biggest, fullest self, then I have the most to offer in whatever capacity I choose to offer that.
But sometimes when we play big, we play too hard. So let's talk about burnout. I know that you have navigated through burnout yourself. What was that experience like, and how did you pull through it?
So burnout, yeah, it's a really important point. And I think playing big, we can misinterpret that to be part of the culture that we live in, which is go, 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 go. It's very masculine based, right? It's productivity. We have to be quote unquote successful. What that looks like is very much tied to status. It's very much tied to finances. It's very much tied to titles. And so when I say play big, I guess I want to clarify that that does for me mean playing to your greatest potential, but with regard to your boundaries, like with real consideration for that, meaning self-care as well, and that meaning taking care of self, not always taking care of other people, because that is where we get into trouble. And I certainly did exactly that. So after 10 years in mental health, I started out in inpatient hospitals back in Philadelphia. I worked at the Renfrew Center, which is an eating disorder specific hospital. I worked for the Children, Youth, and Families in a county situation there, pretty much inner city Philadelphia, and working with some pretty tough families, kids, populations, and people struggling with all kinds of different things. Proceeded to make a move to Montana after I graduated with my master's degree and loved the mountains, always wanted to move west, and found myself out here, and then proceeded to find myself working with some pretty severe populations in terms of intensity of mental health. I did time in inpatient hospital in Denver as well, and then in the school systems and nonprofits. So I spent all this time, working with all kinds of different people. Specifically, mostly my focus was on the trauma. Those were the folks that I got, was mostly folks with PTSD, PTSS, all kinds of different levels and degrees of that. And then I went into my own private practice. And I really enjoyed the flexibility and freedom of that it offered, but also, man, when you get into your own business and you're making your own decisions and no one's telling you you can or you can't, you should or you shouldn't, I think sometimes the pitfall is for those of us with this helping mindset is that we just say yes all the time. So I said yes and yes and yes and yes to pretty much every referral that came my way, and found myself with a caseload of 30 plus people and really just worn down. I ended up losing a client. I had a client die by suicide in my private practice who wasn't showing any signs at all. Certainly, they had a history of suicidal ideation, and that was on the radar, but it had been probably 2 years since that was an active thing on my radar and, to my knowledge, on their radar. And then one day they didn't show up for my session, and I didn't know why. And man, that hit me like a ton of bricks. This person was just my responsibility. It was my practice. It was my business. And then I start worrying about, documentation and lawsuits and the family that this person left behind and all these possibilities and worries and what ifs. And I realize, in retrospect, I was pretty burnt out before this happened. This just happened to be, as we say, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. It really broke me. It took a day off, and then I sort of kept working for a little while because I didn't know what else to do. And after about a month or two of that, I started making a plan to take a sabbatical with some support and some help and my own processing and my own therapy, which was really, really beneficial. I took a 6-month sabbatical completely from clinical work, got my real estate license, and tried on some new things of what I might be able to translate my skill set into, wondering if I would be able to actually tolerate doing counseling anymore. And so that's kind of how I got myself burned out. I just said yes all the time. And certainly we need to, as people who are empathic, as people who want to play big in the world, be really careful about how much we take on and balance it out. Self-care is this buzzword these days, and people think about it as bubble baths and candles and all that sort of stuff. But to circle back to kind of where we started, it still feels like a calling. It still feels like a vocation to me. It still feels compelling as long as I can do it in a way that feels balanced. Today, what that looks like is honestly about 8 to 10 people in terms of clients a week, and then doing supervision for clinicians that are in my practice under my supervision, helping guide and support them and learning the skills that I've honed over the last 15, 20 years. And that's been a really nice way for me to avoid burnout moving forward. I think for me, I've had to just come to terms with my vocation is not my identity. It doesn't define me. Being a psychologist or a psychotherapist isn't all that I am. It was for a long time. And when I stopped telling people that I was doing clinical work or doing therapy and started telling people that I was a real estate agent, man, that shook all kinds of stuff up for me in terms of who I am in the world and how I view myself. Not because there's anything wrong with real estate, but just because I had so deeply integrated that label, that title with me. A lot of the recovery from burnout for me was teasing out and teasing apart the me that's separate from the work that I do, even though the work that I do is very much about who I am. As a therapist, we often say in the training programs, you are your biggest tool. So I, as a therapist, am my biggest tool in helping someone, using my nervous system, regulating my nervous system, having the mirror neurons firing so that I'm helping folks regulate through regulating myself. I'm giving folks a lot of who I am. I'm in relationships with people all the time in the clinical room, and that can be quite draining. So it's hard to tease out, especially in this profession in particular, who am I separate from this? So I've spent a lot more time in the woods. I've spent a lot more time with my dog, who I got as a therapy dog to have in my practice, but really became my therapy dog, it turned out over the years. And a lot more time doing other things, creative outlet kinds of things, to get me back to where I think I was prior to getting to this field, which is love in nature, likes to get muddy and dirty and be with the animals kind of girl. And that's really still at my core who I am. And reconnecting with her has been a lot of the healing from burnout for me.
Let's talk about what does define you. I was going to ask if you felt like this experience that you just talked about helped you refine your purpose. If it did, what does your purpose look like now?
It did help me refine to some degree, and I continue to refine it. It feels like it's a lifelong journey for me in terms of defining who I am. I mean, some of those pieces will stay core. That I have a big heart, that I love big, I feel big, I am an empath. I love to be connected with things that are in the natural world. So I love to hike, I love to bike, I love to ski. It's part of why I chose to move back to Montana as many times as I did. Montana calls me back because of the serenity I think I feel here, because of the peace and quiet and the something about the mountains, something about the vastness of the sky kind of helps ground me in the fact that there's definitely something bigger and it's much bigger than me. Today, all those things are true. And also, how I think about my career and my work has shifted a fair amount. I don't shoulder all of it on my own anymore. I think about the fact that I can have a much bigger impact if I'm able to share my skill sets, share my gifts with other clinicians in the field. I didn't intend to start a group practice. It just sort of evolved, and I feel like when that happens, I'm in the flow, and I like to be in the flow because I've resisted and fought and tried to force a lot of things in my life that hasn't really served me very well. So at this point in my life, I'm trying to be in the flow, trying to accept things that come to me. And one of those things was people looking for supervision. And so I now have 6 clinicians under my supervision and my practice at varying degrees and varying stages of their training. And I'm being pulled and asked to do more teaching and more training and more supervising. And I think the impact that I'm seeing that I can have, when I've looked at my caseload over the course of years and I can see, let's say on average 25 people a week, when I've got 6 clinicians under me, we're seeing 100 plus people a week. Well, I could never in a million years see 100 people a week just by myself. So, I mean, it seems so obvious, but it wasn't to me for a really long time how much we can exponentially have impact on healing and of other people in the field in general. So that's really where I started to lean into. Some of that has been owning my expertise, owning what I've learned. Like this is the not playing small thing, pretending to not know things that I already do really know well doesn't help anybody. One of the ways I'm playing bigger is to really embrace the fact that I've got almost 2 decades of experience in this field. I have a lot to offer. The very first clinician that I hired under my supervision, the original plan was he would do his supervision, and we're required as master's level clinicians to get 3,000 supervised hours of experience before you can be licensed. The goal or the plan was that once that happened, he would go out and do his own private practice. And when that time came, he said, I don't want to leave. I'm learning so much from you, and I love the vision and the mission and where you're going and what you're doing, and I want to stay part of the team if you're okay with that. And I couldn't imagine a bigger vote of confidence or a bigger endorsement of me, my skill set, and what I'm building or what's being built through me. So that gave me a lot of ability to say, yeah, I have something that I have to offer, and say that out loud and say that to other people who might need some of what I have to offer. So I'm doing some of that. I'm also leaning into coaching, which is kind of, in that same ballpark of the teaching, training, advising, consulting, supervising. So I started a coaching business separate from my counseling business called Fully Conscious Coaching. And that's really geared towards other high performing, achieving women in particular who are looking to maybe make a career move or a career change, who are looking to expand or lean into some of their own expertise and experience, who have by and large experienced to some degree of burnout and how to navigate that.
You talked a lot about self-care when you were talking about burnout, and you were talking about making sure you put up boundaries and making sure that you do the things that are right for yourself. What do you do for self-care, and what impact has this had on your effectiveness?
I do some things that I've already mentioned for self-care. So every day I'm outside in nature, doesn't matter the weather. That's a big important part for me personally of self-care, and self-care for everybody's a little bit different. So really it's about finding what works for each individual human. For me, that's a big one. Managing my social life, not saying yes to too many things, is this big self-care for me because I am introverted. I need to plug back in by being alone. I get pulled in a lot of different directions, and there's a lot of things happening. And more and more over the last couple of years, as I've expanded into these other roles, I've found that there's invitations all the time. There's things that are going on all the time, and there's no way to do all the things anyway. But saying no more than saying yes, I would say, is a huge part of self-care, and something I've just in the last few years really been practicing. Other things that I do would be, I do my very best to try to eat pretty well, to try to minimize my alcohol intake, and to, just try to take care of my body in general. It seems silly to say this, and most people would be like, oh, it'd be great to sit for work. It's actually quite hard on the body to sit still for many hours on end every single day. So if I don't get up and move, I don't feel well. I practice yoga. That's been a really important part of my self-care routine. I try to do that at least 3 to 4 times a week. So the other thing for self-care that I have done is go back to learning somewhere along the way. And I wish I could remember off the top of my head where I heard this. There's someone that argues that burnout only comes when we don't feel like we have the skill set that we need to tackle whatever it is that we're facing. And I bristled at that at first, and I sat with it and kind of digested it for a while. I think there's some truth and validity in this idea. So I felt, I think, after the death of my client, that I didn't have the skill set. My confidence was shaken. Did I have the skill set? Maybe. Could I also have been doing more in terms of continuing education to brush up on those skills, to make sure that knife was sharp, so to speak? Yeah, I could. And so I have put a lot of effort and a lot of energy and a lot of time into continuing education. I've defined that as self-care. I think that as whatever your profession, whatever you're doing, the more we can educate ourselves, the more we can stay current and fresh on whatever it is that we need to be current and fresh on to do the best job that we can, is critical to combat burnout. I wouldn't say I'm healed completely. It's like anything else. There's a scar that'll always be there. And I would say that it's a little like riding a bike, to where you're balancing all the time with these micro movements of adjusting to what life's bringing you. So sometimes, if you're going on a steep downhill on your bike, your body position is going to look really different than if you're just on the flat, or if you're going uphill. And life naturally brings us these different times. So sometimes there'll be a little bit more of a challenge to find that space of balance and homeostasis in order to avoid burnout. Yeah. Do we sometimes get a little closer to the edge? Yep, I sure do. Being aware, I think, is probably the number one thing. So if we're not aware of what's going on in our bodies, if we're not aware of what's going on, how I'm sleeping, how my mood is, those kinds of things are great checks and balances. But ultimately, the awareness helps me know what moves to make, and the continuing education part has increased my effectiveness. I feel that level of confidence. The best tools that I have, I'm going to use them to the best of my ability. And then there's a letting go too of whatever that individual needs will end up happening. That feels like it's been incredibly helpful in my practice and in my effectiveness.
Let's go back to your coaching practice and what you're doing with that. I'm curious, are you seeing a lot of cases of women who are starting to feel burned out, or coming to that time when they just know that it's time to make a change? And what advice would you give for someone who's at that point to help mitigate the leap?
I actually feel like I see women more often than not come to me when they are so overwhelmed, way past the point of knowing what to do, that the thought has been in their mind for a long time. And for whatever really good reasons, usually it's stability, usually it's fear of change, usually it's finances, honestly, at the end of the day. These particular kinds of women have usually worked themselves into a phenomenal earning capacity, into a great title, into an amazing career, well-respected positions in the world, and that's across all sorts of different industries. And they've got themselves kind of stuck, or they feel kind of stuck, because it's really hard to sort of walk away from that. It's hard for me to even advise it. How am I going to tell someone to just give up their amazing retirement or pension or, great benefits and ability to manage their schedule to some degree or whatever the benefits are that they have based on the position they're in? I find that people come to me when they are desperate, that they are exasperated, they're worn down, and they don't know what to do. They know they need to do something, but they don't know what it is. And it feels completely overwhelming to a degree of, I would say, even a trauma response, that they go into freeze about what to do next. Often a strategy or a skill or a tool exercise that I invite people to do in these positions is to spend some time journaling about what their life looks like currently. Write out how they feel every morning when they get up. What do they feel like at the end of the day? Checking in throughout the day, really taking the time to slow down, because we're all moving so fast. We are not meant as humans to move to the degree that we're moving in this culture. We're just not. So I asked them to really reflect on, like, what is the current state of your life? And that's across 8 to 12 domains, everything from personal to spiritual to social to financial, family, all those kinds of things. Like, where are you at? We needed to know the temperature. We need to find out where we are today before anything else can happen. Once we have a pretty good roadmap or a pretty good, check of where we are today, well, I'm not terribly happy. There are these great things about what I'm doing, and I'm not feeling fulfilled. I'm not feeling excited about the work. Most often I'm feeling that, getting that women are feeling bored. That seems to be a really common theme, that people are just bored. And there's good reason for that. Women have been doing this, whatever they're doing, for a really long time, and they've fought really hard to get to where they are, but the joy is gone, right? The passion, the drive, the get up in the morning and feel excited about the meetings that you have on your schedule is just no longer there. So first and foremost, I would say that I try to advise folks to try to figure out ways to reignite that flame within the current context. So that might get creative about different committees they can get on, or saying no to some things that are really not things they need to be doing. More often than not, women are saying yes to things that they don't need to be doing, that they can delegate. And so really getting clear about the things that they can take off the plate and potentially open up a little bit of space to remind themselves of why they do this work that they do. If that doesn't work, if that finds, sort of a dead end, and they're still feeling bored, still feeling worn out, still not finding joy or passion in any bit of it, then it's a pretty good indicator it's time to make a move. That's not an immediate pull the plug, just quit your job today, although most women I talk to want to do that. It's much more advantageous to take a little bit of time, it doesn't have to be a long time, to figure out what it is that you want life to look like today. What's really calling to you, what's really exciting you, what's lighting you up, are great questions that I often ask at the executive women's networking thing that we do. And I've found that question to be almost like a guide to where to go next. Because if we follow that, if we follow where our heart is leading us, or where, the passion is, where that calling is, I don't want to say that everything's going to all work out rosy and peachy keen. I do think that it will be okay, though. I think as long as we're following that to some degree, it's all going to work out. So we have to find a way to feed the family and still feel alive in the work we do.
This whole conversation connects to another quote that you live by, Rebecka. And this one is from a poem by Oriah Mountain Dreamer that says, I want to know if you can disappoint another to be true to yourself. How does this connect to the idea of being brave, both in your own life and how you work with your clients?
I would say this quote has guided me in all aspects of my life. It's just a small segment of this poem, which is really quite beautiful. This particular line, this idea of disappointing another to be true to yourself, Glennon Doyle talks about it in her book Untamed, and has a really beautiful little story about her daughter coming home from school and somebody wanting her to do something she didn't want to do. And Glennon says to her, your job is to disappoint that person. Your job, no matter what in this life, is to disappoint, everyone, as long as disappointing them means you're being true to you. And the daughter responds, even you, to her mother. And Glennon says, especially me. And I love the way that that gets articulated there, and the reminder that, so often we are raised with these conditions or conditioning that we are supposed to be, especially as women, be the good girl or say yes even when you don't mean to say yes, or you can, so you should. I think that that ends up getting a lot of us into some pretty muddy waters, thinking that we're helping, thinking that it's for the broader good. We sacrifice ourselves in not positive ways. I think there are ways in which it is beautiful and lovely and appropriate and wonderful to sacrifice something, to give up something to help someone else, but not at the soul level. And I think what I'm feeling and seeing from so many women that are burned out is that they've sacrificed themselves at the soul level to chase whatever it is that they're told they should be chasing. This quote, it comes up in my clinical work all the time. It comes up in my personal life all the time, I would say, pretty frequently. It's been a guiding factor in terms of decisions that I made about ending marriages, or about where to move, or about jobs that I've taken or decided to say no to. I haven't always followed that rule. I haven't always been willing to disappoint another to be true to myself. When I have had no regrets. And I think a lot of the work that I do in my clinical practice is helping people get stronger, build that muscle around being comfortable in that discomfort. It's awful, right? It sucks to feel someone else's disappointment, or, to feel like you're letting someone else down. I often will say that the hardest task, or one of the hardest tasks that we have in this lifetime, is to bear witness to someone else's suffering. And that's part of what we're doing when we disappoint someone else, and we stay true to the authenticity of our own being, because that can be painful for other people. That may mean leaving a relationship where someone really cares about you. It may mean moving far away from family, and those are two things that I've gone through in my life a couple of times, and it is hard to watch someone else suffer. That's a lot of a therapist role, is to witness someone else's suffering. The more we can operate out of that principle, I don't know, Sue, I think the better off all of us would be, but women in particular, who, when they're being true to themselves, are able to be fully alive, show up for the people that are most important to them in their life, to be the best sisters and mothers and daughters and CEOs and entrepreneurs and coworkers and friends that we can possibly be, because we are most fully ourselves when we are staying true to the authenticity of our being.
So, Rebecka, what's next for you? Do you have any audacious goals that you would like to just put out there?
Sue, I have had a goal. So when I was a teenager, as I mentioned, my dad had some pretty amazing clients, and one of which was an Olympic 3-day event rider at the '92 Barcelona Olympics. He became a family friend. I was a teen. I was probably in high school. I don't even remember really how old I was, but I remember vividly sitting in the kitchen of the farmhouse where I grew up, and he was trying to help me kind of, what are you going to do with your life? Kind of this conversation, mentoring, guiding a little bit. And he pulled out a piece of printer paper and put in the middle in this circle, what would you do if you could not fail? And we were just brainstorming. And he really challenged me to say kind of some wild things. So some things on that piece of paper that I still have, I've checked off the list, getting a PhD being one of them. I did not check off the list riding or competing in the Olympics. And one of the things that was on that list that I also haven't done, that's probably more attainable at this stage of the game, is write a book. So if I'm putting a big goal out there that's audacious, that I've actually never said out loud in a public setting before, is I'd like to author and publish a book.
Well, Rebecka, you and I can author and publish our books together next year. So we can have
Amazing.
accountability partnerships right there.
Perfect.
Well, thank you, Rebecka, for joining us today and sharing your insights and wisdom. You have a beautiful heart, and your empathetic approach to people, to situations, and to life is such an amazing gift. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. This is the last show in season 1 of Two Gals and a Mic. So we'll begin our journey again in 2 weeks with season 2, where we will be featuring another group of not so ordinary women who are doing extraordinary things. I'll see you then.